The sound I knew best was the sharp snap of cotton in the wind. A clean, percussive report that cut through the quiet reverence of Arlington. I folded flags. Not just any flags, but the ones that draped the caskets of men and women who had spent their lives in service. Each fold was a ritual, a precise geometry of respect. 13 folds to transform a broad rectangle of colors into a tight, blue triangle of stars. My hands knew the motions without my mind's help, leaving my thoughts free to wander over the endless rows of white stone. My life was a thing of similar neat folds. Apartment, work, grocery store, repeat. A small, manageable triangle that kept me safe from the sharp edges of the world. I was 26, but I felt older, weathered by a quiet kind of poverty that wasn't about starvation but about the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety. My rent was always paid on the first, but never before. My car was a decade old, and every cough from the engine was a potential catastrophe. The careful order of my life was a defense against chaos. He was part of that order, in a way I never acknowledged aloud. Julian Croft. I knew his name because it was carved into the black granite of the most visited memorial in my section. Michael Croft, it read, and below it, a litany of dates and honors. And beside that, a space. A smooth, polished emptiness waiting for a second name. For Julian's name. He was there 3 times a week. Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays. Punctual as a train. I watched him from a distance, using my work as a shield. He was older, maybe by 25 years, with hair the color of salt and silver, cut short and neat. He wore beautifully tailored coats that probably cost more than my car, but he never looked stuffy or out of place. He moved with a quiet economy, a steadiness that seemed to emanate from him like warmth from a stone in the sun. He would stand before the grave for a long time, his hands clasped behind his back, his shoulders straight. He never wept, not that I saw. He just was. Present. A silent, steadfast vigil. My attraction to him was a quiet, hopeless thing, another neatly folded secret I kept tucked away. It wasn't about his obvious wealth. It was about the way he seemed to hold his grief. It wasn't a performance. It was a private, dignified conversation with a ghost. In a world that felt increasingly loud and frantic, his stillness was a kind of gravity. I found myself timing my rounds to coincide with his visits, catching glimpses of his profile against the gray sky, the firm set of his jaw, the way his eyes, even from 50 yards away, seemed to hold a deep and settled sadness. I had a single keepsake of him, if you could call it that. A black leather glove he had dropped one cold November afternoon. I saw it lying on the damp grass after his car, a sleek, dark sedan that whispered rather than rumbled, had pulled away. I picked it up. The leather was impossibly soft, still holding the faint warmth of his hand. I should have turned it into lost and found. Instead, I took it home. It sat in my nightstand drawer, a strange, tangible piece of a man I would never truly know. Sometimes, late at night, I would take it out and just hold it, the scent of leather and something else, something clean and masculine, a phantom connection to his quiet strength. The catalyst came on Memorial Day. The cemetery was a sea of people and miniature flags, one for every stone. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and cut grass, heavy with a collective, unspoken grief. We were short-staffed. A sudden flu had taken out half the ground's crew, and the ceremony at the amphitheater had run long, pushing all our duties into a compressed, frantic schedule. My final task was to collect the ceremonial flags from the main promenade, a dozen large, heavy standards that required careful handling. Then the sky opened up. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in off the Potomac, turning the bright afternoon to a bruised twilight. Rain came down in sheets, cold and unforgiving. The crowd scattered, running for their cars, leaving me alone on the wide, empty walkway. The wind whipped the flags, turning them into angry, snapping beasts on their poles. I struggled with the first one, my fingers clumsy and numb, the wet cotton heavy as a body. I was soaked to the skin in seconds, my thin uniform offering no protection. I was wrestling with the second flag, a furious battle against the wind and rain, when a presence solidified beside me. "You need another pair of hands," a voice said, low and calm, somehow cutting through the roar of the storm. I turned, rain plastering my hair to my forehead, and found myself looking into the steady, gray eyes of Julian Croft. He was holding a large black umbrella, but he wasn't standing under it. He was holding it over me. For a moment, I could only stare. Up close, his face was even more compelling. Fine lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, maps of a life lived. His expression was serious, concerned. He wasn't wearing one of his expensive coats, but a simple, dark rain jacket, the water beating on the shoulders. He didn't wait for my answer. He simply reached out and took hold of the flagpole, his hands sure and strong, stilling its violent thrashing. "Let's get this one down," he said, as if we were colleagues, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for a billionaire to be standing in a downpour, helping a cemetery worker fold a flag. We worked in a strange, focused silence, the only sounds the drumming of rain and the flapping of the flag. His hands were incredible, capable. They moved with the same quiet precision I saw in his posture. He knew the folds. He mirrored my movements perfectly, his large, warm hands guiding the heavy, wet fabric into the prescribed shapes. I could feel the heat of him beside me, a solid, grounding presence in the chaos of the storm. My own shivering seemed to subside just from his proximity. I watched his fingers as they worked opposite mine. They were clean, the nails neatly trimmed. A simple, heavy gold band, smooth with wear, on his right ring finger. Not a wedding band in the traditional sense, but something just as permanent. His late husband's, I presumed. The sight of it sent a complicated pang through my chest, a mix of sorrow for his loss and a sharp, painful awareness of the chasm between our lives. One by one, we wrestled the flags from their poles, the wind fighting us for every inch. Julian never faltered. He moved with an unhurried competence that calmed my own frantic energy. He seemed completely unconcerned with his soaked trousers or the rain dripping from his silver hair. His focus was entirely on the task, on helping me. When we reached the final fold of each flag, our hands would meet in the center, pressing the sodden fabric into its final triangular shape. His fingers would brush against mine, a brief, impersonal contact that felt anything but. A current, warm and startling, shot up my arm each time. When the last flag was folded and resting in the protective carrier, we stood for a moment under the inadequate shelter of the umbrella he still held over me. My teeth were chattering now, the adrenaline fading to a deep, penetrating cold. "Thank you," I managed, my voice sounding thin and shaky. "You didn't have to do that." He finally looked at me, really looked at me, and his gaze was intense, assessing. A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Of course I did," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Respect for the flag doesn't stop when the weather turns bad. And you were drowning out here." He tilted his head slightly. "You're Leo, aren't you?" My heart stuttered. He knew my name. I had a small, plastic name tag pinned to my uniform, but in the dim light and pouring rain, I wouldn't have thought it was legible. "Yes, sir," I stammered. "Julian," he corrected gently. "My name is Julian." He extended a hand, and after a second's hesitation, I took it. His grip was firm, his palm warm and dry despite the rain. My own hand was freezing and damp. It was a formal, proper handshake, but it lingered for a beat too long. His thumb brushed against my knuckles, a small, almost imperceptible gesture that sent another jolt through my system. "You should get out of those wet clothes," he said, his expression softening with what looked like genuine concern. "You'll catch your death." He released my hand, and I felt the loss of his warmth immediately. He gestured with his head toward the parking lot. "My car is just over there. Let me give you a ride to the staff building." It was an offer of simple kindness, but my internal alarms, the ones conditioned by years of self-reliance, started ringing. I was a mess, dripping water and grass onto the pristine pavement. His car was probably worth more than everything I owned. "No, thank you, I'm fine." "It's not far," I said, the automatic refusal of a man who never accepted help because it always came with strings. He didn't push. He just nodded, his gray eyes holding mine. There was no offense in his expression, only a quiet understanding. "All right, Leo," he said. "Stay warm." He gave me one last, lingering look, then turned and walked away, his posture as straight and steady in the storm as it was in the sun. I stood there, shivering, watching him go, the umbrella feeling suddenly useless in my hand. He hadn't just helped me with the flags. He had seen me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the sharp, aching possibility of wanting to be seen again. After that day, The dynamic of our silent cohabitation of the cemetery shifted. It was a subtle change, a barely perceptible realignment of atoms. His visits remained on the same schedule, Tuesdays, Thursdays, Sundays, but he no longer stayed confined to the space around Michael's grave. He would complete his vigil, a quiet communion that I still observed from a respectful distance, and then he would walk. His walks always seemed to end up, coincidentally, in whatever section I was working in. If I was trimming the grass along the eastern slope, he would appear on the path above, pausing to look out over the city. If I was cleaning headstones near the old oaks, he would take a seat on a bench 50 feet away, a book open in his lap, though I rarely saw him turn a page. We didn't speak much at first. He would offer a quiet, "Good morning, Leo," and I would return it. His presence was a weight, but not an unpleasant one. It was the comforting weight of a heavy blanket. It made me intensely aware of myself, the scuffs on my work boots, the way I held the shears, the sweat on my brow. I felt clumsy and unkempt under his gaze, yet simultaneously, I found myself standing a little straighter, moving with more deliberate care. I started analyzing everything. The way he'd nod, the slight incline of his head that served as a greeting, a pause before he spoke, as if weighing each word for its necessity. I was reading tea leaves, searching for meaning in the mundane. Was this just a rich man's boredom? A new routine to fill the empty spaces in his day? Or was it something else? My mind, starved for connection, spun elaborate theories. My heart, cautious and bruised, told my mind to shut up. One particularly cold Thursday morning, the air so crisp it felt like glass, he approached me directly. I was replacing a worn flag on a recent grave, my fingers stiff and clumsy in the chill. "Cold one," he said, his voice a puff of white in the air. "Yes, sir. Julian." I corrected myself quickly. He gave that small, faint smile again. He was holding 2 paper cups from a local coffee shop, steam curling from the lids. He held one out to me. "I thought you might need this," he said. "It's just black." "I hope that's all right." I stared at the cup as if it were a foreign object. It was such a simple gesture, but it felt monumental. No one bought me coffee. My life was structured to avoid such small, unpredictable kindnesses. They were debts, entanglements. "You didn't have to do that," I said, my default response. His smile didn't waver. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." He nudged the cup gently toward me again. "Please. It's just coffee." Slowly, I reached out and took it. The warmth seeped through the cardboard sleeve, a shocking and welcome sensation against my frozen fingers. Our hands brushed again, a fleeting contact. This time, I was sure it wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate, feather-light touch that lasted only a fraction of a second, but sent a distracting warmth spreading through my chest. "Thank you," I said, my voice rough. We stood there for a moment, drinking our coffee in a shared, comfortable silence. The quiet between us was different now. It wasn't the silence of strangers sharing a space. It was the silence of 2 people who were becoming accustomed to each other's presence. I watched him take a sip, his gaze fixed on the horizon, the city a hazy silhouette in the distance. I wondered what he was thinking about. About his husband? About his life? About me? The last thought was an arrogant fantasy, and I dismissed it immediately. He finished his coffee first and crushed the cup in one hand. "Well," he said, turning to me, "I won't keep you from your work." His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something in them. A flicker of loneliness so profound it mirrored my own. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual calm composure. "I'll see you Sunday, Leo." He walked away, and I was left with the warmth of the coffee cup in my hands and the lingering echo of that look. It was the first crack in his stoic facade, the first glimpse of the man behind the tailored coats and the quiet dignity. He was lonely. The realization didn't feel triumphant. It felt connecting. It was a language we both understood. The next meaningful touch happened a week later. A section of the cemetery had been damaged by a fallen branch during a windstorm, knocking over a small, older headstone. It was too heavy for me to lift alone. I was assessing the situation, trying to figure out how to get leverage, when Julian appeared, as if summoned. "Looks heavy," he observed, rolling up the sleeves of his cashmere sweater. "It is." I was about to call for help. I said. "No need," he said, positioning himself on the other side of the stone. "We can manage it." On 3-inch we bent our knees, our shoulders almost touching. He counted, his voice low and steady. We lifted together, the rough, cold stone biting into our fingers. It was a strain, but we managed to set it back in place, grunting with the effort. As we straightened up, I stumbled slightly on the uneven ground. His hand shot out, grabbing my arm to steady me. His grip was strong, wrapping around my bicep. It wasn't a fleeting touch this time. His fingers pressed into my arm, holding me for a moment longer than necessary. I could feel the strength in his hand, the latent power. But it was gentle, protective, careful, he said, his voice close to my ear. His breath was warm against my skin. I froze, my entire body humming with a sudden, intense awareness of him. His scent, that clean, subtle fragrance mixed with the smell of damp earth and old wool. The solidness of his body so close to mine. He let go, but his hand slid slowly down my arm, his fingers trailing over my forearm before dropping away. He didn't apologize or make a joke to dispel the tension. He just stepped back, his expression unreadable, and looked at the reset headstone. "There," he said, his voice a little thicker than usual. Good as new, I couldn't find my voice. I just nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs. That touch had been unambiguous. It was a clear signal, a question asked without words. And in my frozen silence, I had given no answer. The air between us was charged, thick with all the things we weren't saying. He looked at me, his gray eyes searching my face, and then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if accepting my non-response. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me with the ghost of his touch burning on my skin and a profound sense of a missed opportunity. The cemetery management decided to undertake a restoration project in the oldest section, where time and weather had worn many of the 19th century markers to smooth, illegible ghosts. It was a massive undertaking, funded by a single, anonymous donor. I knew, without anyone telling me, that the donor was Julian. His quiet influence was everywhere in this place. The project required extra hands, and instead of just observing from a distance, Julian started showing up in work clothes. Old jeans, worn boots, a faded university sweatshirt. It was a costume of sorts, but it had the strange effect of making him seem more real, more approachable. He wasn't playing at being a worker. He was actually working. He had a quiet conference with the head of grounds, and then he was assigned to my section. Officially, he was a volunteer. Unofficially, he was my partner. Our first task together was building simple wooden frames to protect the most fragile stones from the heavy equipment that would be coming in. We worked from a stack of pre-cut lumber and a bucket of nails. It was honest, physical labor. The rhythmic sound of our hammers became the new soundtrack to our interactions. Working side by side with him was a revelation. He was meticulous, patient. He measured twice, drove nails in with clean, efficient strokes. He didn't talk much, but the silence was productive, companionable. We fell into an easy rhythm, passing the hammer back and forth, holding boards steady for each other. In the shared focus of the task, the vast difference in our stations seemed to meld away. We were just two men, building something together. I saw a different side of him. A small, self-deprecating smile when he hit his thumb with the hammer. A quiet chuckle when I nearly tripped over a stray board. These small moments of shared humanity were more intimate than any conversation we'd had before. He was no longer just the stoic, grieving widower. He was a man who could be clumsy, who could laugh at himself. During a water break, we sat on an overturned wheelbarrow, the afternoon sun warm on our faces. We were both covered in a fine layer of sawdust, and my hands ached from the unaccustomed work. He was staring at his hands, turning them over as if they were unfamiliar to him. "It's been a long time since I've done anything like this," he said, his voice quiet and reflective. "Anything real?" He glanced at me, a vulnerable, almost shy look in his eyes. "In my world, you pay people to do the real things. To build, to fix, to create. You end up insulated, untouched." It was the most he had ever revealed about himself. An admission of a different kind of poverty, a poverty of experience. "My hands are soft," he added, a statement of fact with no self-pity in it. "They seem to be working just fine," I said, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "They're learning," he said. He then fell silent, his gaze drifting back toward the grave of his husband, visible on the far hill. I followed his line of sight. It was a constant presence, the anchor point of his life in this place. Michael was the one who was good with his hands. Julian said softly, not looking at me. He could build anything. A cabinet, a garden wall, a life. The words were filled with a deep, quiet love that was so palpable it made my own chest ache. He would have loved this. Getting his hands dirty. Making something right again. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry for your loss. Felt like a hollow, useless platitude. So I said nothing. I just sat with him in his memory, offering my presence as the only comfort I could. He must have sensed my unease, because he turned his head and looked directly at me. His expression was open, unguarded. I worry, sometimes, he said, his voice dropping even lower, that my being here, my volunteering, puts you in an awkward position. He paused, choosing his words with care. I don't want you to ever feel pressured or like you owe me anything for my help. Or for a cup of coffee. The directness of his statement caught me off guard. He was naming the elephant in the room. He was acknowledging the power imbalance, the unspoken tension that had been humming between us for weeks. He was giving me an out. I don't, I said, and the honesty of my own voice surprised me. I appreciate the help. And the coffee. He held my gaze, his gray eyes searching mine. Good, he said, a single word that carried a world of meaning. Because I enjoy the company, it was a breakthrough. An open door. He had laid his cards on the table, not in a grand, romantic gesture, but in a quiet, respectful admission. He had explained his boundaries to ensure my comfort. He wasn't a predator or a patron looking for a project. He was just a man, a lonely man, who enjoyed my company. And in that moment, sitting on a wheelbarrow covered in sawdust, I realized with a startling, heart-stopping clarity that I enjoyed his, too, more than I had let myself admit. The work on the restoration project continued, and with it, the slow, steady construction of something new between us. The foundation had been laid with his quiet confession, and now, we were tentatively building the walls. The air of ambiguity had mostly dissipated, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of shared purpose. We were a team. Our conversations grew from stilted pleasantries into something more substantial. He asked me about my life before Arlington, and I found myself telling him about growing up in a small town in Ohio, about the community college courses I'd taken before my mother got sick and I had to start working full-time. I spoke of things I hadn't discussed with anyone in years. He listened. He didn't offer pity or advice. He just listened with an attentiveness that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't realized I was missing. In return, he shared small pieces of his life with Michael. Not the grand stories of their travels or their success, but the small, domestic details. How Michael had been a terrible cook but insisted on making breakfast every Sunday. How he had a ridiculous, booming laugh that could fill their entire house. He spoke of him not as a saint or a tragedy, but as a real, flawed, beloved person. In sharing his past, he was inviting me into his present. The easy camaraderie we found in our work began to attract notice. The other groundskeepers were a decent bunch, but they weren't blind. They saw the expensive car in the staff lot and the man who owned it spending his days hauling dirt and lumber with me. It started with jokes. Hey Leo, your rich boyfriend is looking for you. One of them, a guy named Dave, called out one afternoon. I felt a hot flush of shame and anger creep up my neck. I mumbled something non-committal and kept walking, but the comment landed like a stone in my gut. It touched on all my deepest insecurities, the fear of being seen as a gold digger, a kept boy. It reduced the fragile, complicated thing growing between Julian and me to a crude, transactional cliché. Julian, who had been coiling a hose nearby, must have overheard. He didn't react immediately, but I saw his shoulders tense. A few minutes later, as we were loading tools into the shed, he spoke, his back still to me. Does that happen often? He asked, his voice carefully neutral. It's just stupid talk, I said, trying to sound dismissive, but my voice was tight. He turned to face me, his expression serious. It's not stupid if it bothers you, Leo, he said. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small, shadowed space of the shed. This is what I was worried about. The optics. How this looks to other people. He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. The last thing I ever want is for my presence to cause you trouble or embarrassment. His concern was so genuine, so focused on my well-being, that it disarmed my anger. It's not you, I said quietly. It's me. I don't like people thinking that I'm that weird. I couldn't finish the sentence. That you're with me for my money. He finished for me, his voice gentle. I flinched but nodded. He held my gaze, his own unwavering. Anyone who thinks that doesn't know you at all. And they certainly don't know me, he paused, and the air between us grew thick with unspoken words. But their opinion doesn't matter. Yours is the only one that does. If this is too much, you just have to say the word. I will walk away and go back to being a quiet visitor. No questions asked, he was offering me the ultimate respect, the power to end it, to send him away. And in that moment, the thought of him going back to being a distant figure across the lawns, of our easy silences and shared work vanishing, was unbearable. It was a physical ache in my chest. This was the tipping point. The moment where silence was no longer an option. I had to choose. Retreat into my safe, folded life, or step forward into this terrifying, wonderful unknown. I took a breath. I don't want you to walk away. Relief washed over his features, a subtle softening of the lines around his eyes. Okay, he said softly. Then we'll have to stop hiding. The statement hung in the air. It wasn't a question. It was a proposal. He took another small step, closing the remaining distance between us. He was so close I could see the flecks of gold in his gray eyes. I would like to take you to dinner, Leo, he said, his voice a low murmur. Away from here. Not as a volunteer and a groundskeeper. Just as Julian. And Leo, my heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. Okay. I whispered, the word feeling impossibly large in my mouth. Is that a yes? He asked, a hint of a teasing smile playing on his lips, testing the ground. Yes, I said, my voice firmer this time. Yes, Julian. I'd like that very much. The smile that broke across his face was like the sun breaking through clouds. It was a real, unguarded smile, and it transformed him, erasing years from his face. He didn't touch me. He didn't need to. The space between us was already alive, crackling with a promise that was finally, terrifyingly, being spoken aloud. He chose a small Italian restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street in Georgetown. It was elegant but not intimidating, the kind of place with white tablecloths and low lighting, but where the murmur of conversation was warm and relaxed. He had clearly chosen it to put me at ease, and I was grateful for his perceptiveness. Still, I felt like an imposter in my best shirt and a pair of slacks that suddenly felt cheap and ill-fitting. Julian, of course, looked perfect. He wore a simple dark gray suit, no tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt open at the throat. He looked distinguished, handsome, and completely out of my league. The anxiety I had managed to keep at bay all day came rushing back. What were we doing here? What was I thinking? He must have seen the panic in my eyes as I sat down. He reached across the small table and laid his hand over mine. It was a simple, grounding gesture. His hand was warm and steady, the weight of it a reassurance. Breathe, Leo, he said softly, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. It's just dinner. I took a shaky breath and nodded. Sorry, I mumbled. I'm not used to this, neither am I, he admitted, and his honesty was a balm. It's been a very long time. We can be nervous together. He gave my hand a gentle squeeze before withdrawing his, giving me back my space. The dinner was, against all my fears, easy. The conversation flowed naturally, picking up where we left off in the tool shed, but deepening in the intimacy of the candlelit restaurant. We talked about books, about music, about the ridiculous politics of the city. He asked me about my dreams, the ones I had folded away with my art school brochures years ago. I found myself telling him about my love for drawing, for capturing faces and landscapes in charcoal, a passion I hadn't indulged in years. He listened with that same deep, unwavering attention, making me feel like the most interesting person in the world. And then, as the waiter cleared our main courses, he looked at me, his expression turning serious. Leo, I need to be completely honest with you, he said, his voice low. I haven't felt this possibility of a beginning in years. Not since Michael. He paused, and I saw the familiar shadow of grief pass through his eyes. What I had with him was the foundation of my life. I'm not looking to replace that. I couldn't. But my house has been quiet for a very long time. And my life has been gray. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. Since I met you, there has been color again. Your quiet dedication, your gentleness, the way you move through the world with such careful dignity, it woke something up in me. I find myself looking forward to Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Sundays for a reason that has nothing to do with mourning, My throat was tight. I couldn't speak. All I could do was listen as he laid his heart bare. I am also acutely aware that I am 27 years older than you, he continued, and that I live in a world that is profoundly different from yours. I know what people will say, and I know the fears you must have. I have them, too. I'm terrified of being seen as some lonely old man buying affection. I'm terrified of making you feel trapped or obligated. He took a sip of water, his hand not quite steady. So I'm putting all my cards on the table. My feelings for you are real. They are not transactional, and they come with no expectations. All I'm asking for is a chance to see what we could be. It was the most honest, vulnerable confession I had ever heard. He had taken all my fears, all my insecurities, and named them himself, acknowledging their validity. He wasn't dismissing them. He was facing them with me. He was balancing the power between us with the sheer force of his honesty. It was my turn. I had to be just as brave. I was watching you for months, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Before the storm, I was drawn to your stillness. To the way you were so constant. I looked down at my hands, twisting a napkin in my lap. I've been lonely for a very long time, Julian. I build walls to keep myself safe. And you didn't try to knock them down. You just showed up with coffee and started helping me work. You made it safe to open the gate. I finally looked up and met his eyes. I'm scared, I said, but I'm more scared of letting you walk away. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face. It reached his eyes, making them shine in the candlelight. He didn't say anything. He just reached across the table and took my hand again, his fingers lacing with mine. It wasn't a handshake or a comforting pat. It was a connection, an agreement. He drove me home, the silence in the car comfortable, filled with the warm aftermath of our confessions. His car smelled of leather and his subtle, clean scent. It felt like a protective bubble moving through the sleeping city. He walked me to the door of my worn-down apartment building. The chipped paint and buzzing fluorescent light of the lobby, a stark contrast to the world we had just left. Under the sickly yellow light, my insecurities flared one last time. This was my reality. Was he really sure he wanted any part of it? As if reading my mind, he stepped closer, blocking my view of the peeling paint on the door. He lifted a hand, not to touch my face, but to gently cup the back of my neck, his thumb resting just below my ear. The touch was electric, intimate. You spend your days folding flags with such reverence, Leo, he said, his voice a deep, soft murmur. Your hands create such order and respect out of chaos. He brought his other hand up and gently took my hand, the one not holding my keys. He didn't shake it. He turned it over, his thumb tracing the calluses on my palm. Let me hold them for a while. He folded my fingers into his, a slow, deliberate gesture that mirrored the work I did every day. But this was an act of connection, not conclusion. He looked down at our joined hands, then back up at my face. His eyes were dark with an emotion I couldn't quite name, but it made my breath catch in my throat. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. I met him halfway, my eyes fluttering shut as his lips met mine. The kiss was everything our time together had been. Slow, patient, and filled with a profound, unspoken tenderness. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion, but of deep, soul-shaking recognition. It was a question and an answer, a promise and a relief. It tasted of red wine and honesty. His lips were soft, his touch gentle but firm. He wasn't taking, he was offering. He was giving. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine, our breath mingling in the cool night air. My eyes remained closed, trying to commit every sensation to memory. The solid weight of his hand on my neck, the soft scratch of his evening stubble against my skin, the feeling of his fingers intertwined with mine. It felt right. Impossibly, terrifyingly, perfectly right. Okay, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Okay, I breathed back. It was the only word I had. It was the only word we needed. I woke the next morning to the familiar gray light filtering through my cheap blinds and the immediate, jarring thought. What have I done? The warmth and certainty of the previous night evaporated in the harsh light of day, replaced by a cold tide of anxiety. The kiss, the confessions, his hand in mine, it all felt like a dream. A beautiful, impossible dream. My apartment had never felt smaller or shabbier. I saw it through his eyes, the crack in the ceiling, the threadbare armchair, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. He lived in a mansion in McLean. I lived in a box in Alexandria. The sheer, immovable reality of our different worlds came crashing down on me. I was a project, a diversion, a feel-good story for the lonely billionaire. The cruelest voice in my head, the one I usually kept locked away, was screaming. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. My stomach clenched. It was a text from him. I stared at it for a full minute before I could summon the courage to read it. Good morning, Leo. I hope you slept well. Thinking of you. No expectations. The last two words were a lifeline. No expectations. He understood. He anticipated my morning after panic. He was giving me space, reassuring me, even from a distance. It was another one of his quiet, perceptive acts of care. The knot in my stomach loosened, just a little. I spent the day in a fog, going through the motions of my weekend chores, my mind replaying every moment of our dinner, every word of our conversation, every second of that kiss. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but a fragile shoot of hope was pushing its way through. He didn't call or text again, respecting the space he had offered. The silence was both a comfort and a torture. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was a wreck of nerves. My shift at the cemetery felt different. Every rustle of leaves, every car that pulled into the lot, made my head snap up. I was waiting for him. He arrived at his usual time. He was wearing one of his fine wool coats, his silver hair catching the weak afternoon light. He walked to Michael's grave and stood his vigil, just as he always did. From my vantage point across the lawn, nothing had changed. My heart sank. Had he reconsidered? Was last night a mistake? Was he going to retreat back into his silent, distant routine? After a long time, he turned from the grave. But he didn't start one of his meandering walks. He walked directly toward me, his stride purposeful, his eyes locked on mine. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of me. "Hello, Leo," he said, his voice calm and steady, but his eyes were full of a gentle warmth that chased away my fear. "Julian," I said, my voice barely audible. He looked around at the quiet, empty rows of white stones. "This place has been a sanctuary for me," he said. "But I think, for us to have a real chance, we need to build a sanctuary of our own. One that doesn't have ghosts." He met my eyes again. "But I also know this place is important to you. It's your work. I don't ever want to take that away from you." He was addressing the imbalance again, head on. He was reassuring me that he wasn't trying to rescue me from my life, but to become a part of it, respectfully. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about what you said. About your drawing." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out not a wallet, but a simple, flat key on a plain silver ring. He held it out to me on his open palm. "I have a small studio space above the garage at my house. It has the best light. No one ever uses it. I thought, maybe you'd like to see it sometime. Use it if you want. No strings. Just a quiet place to create. If you ever feel the urge." I stared at the key. It was an incredible offer. A generous, thoughtful, terrifying offer. It was a key to his home, to his world. My first instinct was to refuse. It was too much, too soon. It felt like a payment, a gilded cage. He must have seen the conflict on my face. "It's just a key to a room, Leo," he said gently. "It's not a key to you. You can take it, and you can never use it. You can take it, and you can give it back tomorrow. The choice is entirely yours. All it means is that there's a space for you in my world. If you want it." His careful framing, his constant reinforcement of my autonomy, was the most seductive thing about him. He wasn't trying to control me. He was trying to empower me. He wasn't offering to solve my problems. He was offering me a space where I could solve them myself. Slowly, I reached out and took the key from his palm. It was cool and heavy. My fingers brushed against his, and this time, I didn't pull away. I let them linger. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt inadequate. A week later, we had our first public test. Julian had invited me to a charity concert at the Kennedy Center. It was a world away from muddy boots and sawdust. I rented a tuxedo, an expense that made me wince, but I was determined not to look like a charity case on his arm. Walking into the grand lobby, I felt the immediate shift in atmosphere. The air was thick with perfume and the low hum of influential voices. People knew Julian. Heads turned. Eyes followed us. I could feel their gazes on my back, could almost hear the whispered questions. "Who is that with Julian Croft?" I felt my shoulders hunch, my carefully constructed confidence beginning to crumble. Julian seemed oblivious, but I knew he wasn't. He navigated the crowd with an easy grace, one hand resting lightly on the small of my back. It was a subtle gesture of possession, of protection. When an older woman with a helmet of lacquered hair and a frightening amount of jewelry stopped him, her eyes flicking over me with barely disguised curiosity, I braced myself. "Julian, darling," she trilled. "How wonderful to see you out, Eleanor," he said, his smile polite but cool. "Good to see you." He didn't let go of me. Instead, his hand tightened slightly on my back. "Eleanor, I'd like you to meet my partner, Leo." The word hit me with the force of a physical blow. Partner. He hadn't said my friend or my guest. He had defined us, right there, in front of one of the city's biggest gossips. He had drawn a line in the sand. He was claiming me. The woman's perfectly plucked eyebrows shot up, her polite smile freezing for a fraction of a second before she recovered. "How lovely," she said, her tone a little strained. She gave me a dismissive nod and quickly turned her attention back to Julian. Julian didn't let her. He kept his body angled toward me, including me in the conversation, directing questions my way. He made it clear that we were a unit. It was a masterclass in social maneuvering, a quiet, powerful declaration. He was protecting me not by hiding me, but by elevating me. Later, during intermission, as we stood on the balcony overlooking the river, I was still processing it. "Partner," I said, trying to keep my voice light. He turned to me, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Is that all right?" he asked. It felt like the most honest word. "It's a strong word," I said. "I feel strongly," he replied simply. He reached out and took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine, right there in the open for anyone to see. "I'm done with ambiguity, Leo, and I'm done hiding you. If people have a problem with it, it is, quite frankly, their problem, not ours." The simple, solid weight of his hand in mine, the quiet resolution in his voice, it was an anchor. The whispers and the curious stares no longer mattered. He had built a fortress around us with a single word and a simple gesture. The doubt didn't vanish completely, but for the first time, I felt like we were truly on the same side of the wall. We began to build a life, one quiet, deliberate choice at a time. I used the key. The first time I drove up the long, winding driveway to his house, my old car felt like it was hyperventilating. The house wasn't a mansion. It was a sprawling, modern masterpiece of glass and stone, nestled into a wooded hillside overlooking the river. It was beautiful and terrifying. Julian met me at the door, and instead of giving me a grand tour, he just smiled and said, "The studio is this way." He led me through a pristine, art-filled hallway to a side door that opened onto a set of stairs. The studio was exactly as he described. A huge room with a slanted, north-facing wall of glass. An easel stood in the corner, a blank canvas waiting. There was a drafting table and shelves stocked with every kind of paper, charcoal, and paint imaginable. "Michael had this built for a friend of his, an artist," Julian explained, his voice soft. "She moved to Santa Fe a few years ago. It's been empty ever since." He gestured around the room. "It's yours to use, whenever you want. I won't bother you. The door at the bottom of the stairs leads directly outside, so you can come and go as you please." He was, once again, giving me my independence. A space that was mine within his space. I walked over to the window, looking out at the incredible view. "It's amazing, Julian. I hope it brings you some joy," he said simply. He started to leave, to give me the space he promised, but I turned. "Wait," I said. "Don't go." He stopped, a question in his eyes. Will you stay? Just for a little while?" I asked. A slow smile spread across his face. "I'd like that very much." I started spending my weekends there. At first, I just sat in the space, getting used to it. Then, I started to draw. Simple things at first. A tree outside the window. A bowl of fruit from his kitchen. Then, one afternoon, while he was reading in a chair in the corner, pretending not to watch me, I started to draw him. I sketched the way the light caught his silver hair, the strong line of his jaw, the quiet concentration in his eyes. He became my favorite subject. And through drawing him, I learned the geography of his face, the subtle shifts in his expression, the quiet strength that radiated from him even in repose. The studio became our sanctuary. It was where the pressures of the outside world, the disparities in our ages and our bank accounts, faded into the background. In that room, we were just Leo and Julian, an artist and his muse, two men falling in love. Our intimacy grew in that quiet space. It wasn't just physical, though that was a part of it. Slow, tender explorations that were as much about learning each other as they were about pleasure. The true intimacy was in the shared silence. It was in him bringing me a sandwich and a glass of iced tea when I had been drawing for hours and forgotten to eat. It was in me finding a rare first edition of a book he'd mentioned loving, using a week's salary to buy it for him, and seeing the genuine, unfeigned delight in his eyes. We made conscious choices about how to merge our lives. I refused to quit my job at the cemetery. It was my anchor to my own life, my own identity. He understood without me having to explain it. He never offered me money, but he did something more profound. He set up a blind trust with an arts foundation and had them offer me a grant, a modest but steady stipend that allowed me to work fewer hours at Arlington and spend more time in the studio. He told me about it only after it was done, framing it as a professional opportunity he had simply recommended me for. It was his way of supporting my passion without making me feel like a dependent. It was an act of profound respect. One Saturday morning, I woke up not in my own cramped apartment, but in his vast, comfortable bed. The sun was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting stripes of light across the cool, white sheets. Julian was already awake, sitting in a chair by the window, a coffee cup in his hand, just watching me. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Hi," I said, my voice thick with sleep. I sat up, the sheet pooling around my waist. The room was the size of my entire apartment, with a breathtaking view of the river. For a moment, the old anxiety flickered. This was his world, not mine. He seemed to sense it. He got up and came over to the bed, sitting on the edge. He didn't say anything, just reached out and brushed a stray piece of hair off my forehead. It was a simple, domestic gesture. The kind of thing you do for someone you know, someone you love. "I was thinking of making breakfast," he said. "Michael was a terrible cook, you know. But I'm not. I make excellent pancakes," I smiled. "I like pancakes." "Good," he said. He leaned in and gave me a soft, lingering kiss. "Then let's go make some later." We stood side by side in his enormous, professional-grade kitchen, which suddenly felt cozy and welcoming. I was mixing the batter while he sliced strawberries. The morning light filled the space. The smell of coffee and sizzling butter was in the air. It didn't feel like I was a visitor in a billionaire's house. It felt like we were just two people making breakfast together in our kitchen. It felt like home. We ate on the terrace, the quiet of the morning broken only by the sound of birds and the distant hum of the city waking up. I looked at him, at the man who had so patiently and respectfully entered my life, who had offered me not a rescue, but a partnership. The age difference, the wealth, they were still facts. They would always be a part of our story, but they were no longer the headline. They were the context, the backdrop to the much more important story of two lonely men who found each other in the quietest of places. He caught me looking at him and smiled. "What is it?" he asked. "Nothing," I said, smiling back. "Everything." I reached across the table and took his hand. His fingers, no longer soft from a life of insulation, but calloused from our shared work, curled around mine. His grip was firm, steady, the same way it had been that first day in the rain. I thought about my old life, the one of neat, safe folds. It had kept me from falling apart, but it had also kept me from living. Julian hadn't unfolded my life for me. He had simply shown me that it was safe to do it myself. He had handed me the tools and the space, and he had trusted me to build something new. And we had, together. I was no longer afraid. I was steady. I was home, and I held on to his hand. This man who had started as a silent, grieving figure on a distant hill, and I didn't let go. Share your thoughts in the comments. What moment stayed with you? If the story resonated, a like helps others find it. Subscribe for more slow burn male/male love stories told with warmth and care.